I would like to start today by thanking you very much for the opportunity to come to Paris and to speak to you today. So it's a great honor to be here, and I think this is the most beautiful lecture hall that I have ever spoken in. So today I'm going to talk a bit about the past, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the future, and I'm going to try to give you a perspective of what I've been doing for the last 30 years, working on polar bears in the Canadian Arctic, as well as a period of time working in the Norwegian Arctic. So as a bit of an overview, we just heard a much more detailed history of polar bear and bear evolution in general. I'm just going to touch on some of the characteristics of what makes a polar bear, and how this is important when we look at the future going forward in time. I'm going to talk just a little bit about the current status of polar bears and where we think this is going to be going in the near future. And then I'm going to talk about the changing Arctic. And I'm going to focus mainly on the issue of climate change, but I'll touch on a couple of other issues as well. Now, we've just heard a lot about where this bear came from. And of course, this is the ancestral polar bear. So the interesting thing here is that we have a brown terrestrial omnivore with a very diverse diet and a very different life history that in a relatively rapid evolution moved from land to a marine environment and became a carnivorous white marine mammal. So it's one of the things to remember that we have polar bears that are born on the sea ice, live their whole life on the sea ice, and never step on land. There is no requirement for land in the life cycle of some polar bear populations. So I think everybody can understand these are two very good species, but we are seeing some history replaying. This is a hybrid polar bear, grizzly bear cross that was seen in the Canadian Arctic last spring. My guess is it will probably be a rug this coming spring because the hunters are very keen to catch these animals. They're very valuable. And actually in Canada, we don't have a management system for hybrid bears, so there is no management of these animals in the Canadian Arctic. But we have seen many hybrids in the community I was working in this past spring. There were 2 hybrid cubs shot along with a polar bear mother. Nonetheless, these are very good species in the classical construct of what we think a species is. If you give an anatomist a grizzly bear skull, it looks very different from a polar bear skull. There are very diagnostic features, one of them being right at the base of the eyes. You have a very sharp break in the grizzly bear skull, whereas the polar bear skull is much more elongated. One of the reasons polar bears have a very different skull structure is they have a very different diet. And recent work that's been done on the structure of the skull shows that it is very adapted to this very different diet. So it's actually not as strong as a grizzly bear skull. Grizzly bear skulls are designed to break down plant tissue, grind up very difficult material to digest, whereas polar bears have a diet that's very easy to digest, and it's largely seals, which are their prey. We have seen changes in the dentition of teeth, so the cheek teeth are going back to a more carnivorous state. One of the other things, though, is this elongation of the skull is tied to a very different life history characteristic. And one of them is that polar bears are active throughout the whole winter period when the temperatures are incredibly cold. It's impossible right now to go into the Canadian Arctic and find a grizzly bear anywhere. They're all hibernating. They've all moved into dens. Most of the bears are in dens just about the end of October into the beginning of November. Very different life history strategies that these two animals have taken. Within that, you can see the adaptations, and they are very different. The grizzly bear or brown bear is largely designed to be active during warm periods. Its feet don't have hair on them, so they don't need to keep their feet warm, but their claws are designed largely for excavation. So they're digging up roots, so you're using their claws to pull down branches for feeding on berries, digging through logs for insects. If we look at polar bears, they have a much more carnivorous type of claw. one that's designed for grasping prey, manipulating these prey once they catch them, but also lots of fur on the feet, which provides traction on slippery surfaces and also, of course, keeps their feet warm. So these differences are very profound. You can see it right into the life history characteristics. Grizzly bears typically have more than 2 cubs in a litter, and the interesting thing is that down you see the small cub on the far side there with this nice milky face. That cub is actually feeding on a pair of mammary glands that polar bears no longer have. So grizzly bears have 6 mammary glands, or grizzly bears have these 6 functional mammary glands, whereas polar bears only have 4. So there's quite a difference here in terms of the life history, and this reflects a very different lifestyle. And so this is partly talking about this issue of adaptation. This is an animal that has adapted to a very, very different life history strategy. They tend to have smaller litters, but there are some similarities in that they do keep their cubs for very extended periods. Part of the reason is it's a complicated life to live out in the sea ice environment. So over this 2.5 years, the mothers are teaching their cubs migration patterns and, of course, hunting patterns, and basically the skills needed to survive. One of the problems we have with managing polar bears, particularly when we're talking about trying to take a yield of a harvest from a population, is that the populations are very slow to grow. We can think that most populations under ideal conditions can maybe grow at 4 or 5%, but that would be exceptional. We think that most populations are probably growing about 1 to 2% if they're growing at all, and this is under historical conditions. The other problem we've got is that these are long-lived animals. So when we talk about the effects of climate change on a population, you can't consider all polar bears to be equal when the climate is changing, when the conditions are changing. A very small cub that is born and is leaving its den weighing perhaps 8 or 10 kilograms is very different than a large adult male that is extremely fat that maybe weighs 800 kilograms. So this diversity is huge, and the effects of climate change are felt differently across the populations. And in reality, what we see is the most vulnerable groups in a population are the very young and the very old. When the conditions get tough, those are the animals that die. But more than anything else, this is an animal that depends on ice-covered seas. If you don't have sufficient ice cover, you do not have polar bears. It is a marine mammal. It is classified that way in many parts of the world. But it's also more complicated than that, because it's not a polar bear that's found, or a species that is found everywhere that there is sea ice. This is the global distribution of polar bears looking down from the pole. And what you notice very quickly is that there are high density areas, and those high density areas correspond directly with the continental shelf areas. So when we think about warming and the responses of species to warming, it's very clear that species will migrate northward and species will migrate upward if they're in a mountainous habitat. The problem for polar bears is there's nowhere to go. You can't push them further north, because if you do, you push them into the Arctic Ocean, which is incredibly deep waters, it's nutrient poor, it's not very good habitat. The bears that live there are incredibly low in density. Very few animals live in those areas. There's just not much for them to eat. The densities are higher where the marine productivity is higher in these nearshore areas. But it gets even more complicated than that, because you have to consider that the southernmost distribution of bears are actually as far south as London, England, if you look at the James Bay area in the Canadian Arctic. So we have this species that has this massive geographic range from east to west and north to south. And this means that as the climate changes, we're going to see very many different scenarios play out over time. And I have no doubt that when hunters tell me that they are seeing lots of bears in their particular area, I have no problems with that. But hunters hunt in their areas, and their knowledge is geographic specific. Whereas scientists, we tend to look at broader geographic issues, and when we look at the status of polar bears in the circumpolar Arctic, we have these 19 different populations. It means that these will change under 19 different timelines. Some of the populations that we have are doing just fine right now, others are doing very poorly. And one of the things to remember is that the prey of polar bears are dependent on the presence of sea ice. The distribution of the two main prey items, the ring seal and the bearded seal, are absolutely dependent on the presence of sea ice. They use it for giving birth to their offspring, and if you don't have enough sea ice for long enough periods of time, you don't have these seals. If you don't have the seals, you don't have the bears. So there's a pattern here of dependence on sea ice. Now, polar bears can eat other things, but the reason that they can eat other things, such as walrus or beluga whale, is because they have access to those two species of seals. It's not the other way around. This is a king eider. It's probably one of the most colorful things that a polar bear will eat, but it can eat king eiders because it has access to an incredibly energy-rich diet. So this is a fairly typical sort of scenario. This is a young male bear that's just killed a young bearded seal. This is actually probably an unhappy bear. This is not a very fat seal, and that's not really what polar bears want to eat. So we think about polar bears being the most carnivorous of mammals, but carnivorous actually means a meat eater. And in reality, what polar bears want to do is they want to eat the fat of marine mammals. In particular, this is a ring seal that was killed, weighed about 70 kilograms. And what you see is this is fairly typical. They strip the fat off the outer part of the seal, and that is what they'll eat. Given their preference, they'll eat about 90% fat from a seal. The other is about 10% protein that they get through skin and some of the muscle. So in essence, when a polar bear kills a seal, this is sort of the equivalent of living off of a diet of butter. It's an incredibly rich diet. And so one seal has this massive amount of energy. And the other thing that you have to remember is that a polar bear can consume about 20% of its body mass in a single meal. So if we think about a 500 kilogram polar bear eating one big bearded seal, it can easily consume 100 kilograms of fat in one meal. Out of that 100 kilograms, about 95 kilograms will be deposited directly onto its own fat cells. That is the life history of this animal. It is a fat processing machine. It takes this fat in the springtime during a very small window of opportunity, when these seals are vulnerable because they're giving birth to their young, and they take these very few seals and they put them into their body energy stores. And that's what makes a polar bear work, because outside of those 2 or 3 months in the springtime, the bears are going to be losing weight. And this is one of the challenges for this species. It's an animal that's already living on the edge in much of its distribution. If we look at the home range size, when you have such an energy-rich diet, you can have these massive home ranges. The areas that polar bears move over in a single year range between 300,000 and 600,000 square kilometers. You can compare that to a grizzly bear in the Arctic, which maybe moves over 1,000 square kilometers. Vastly different life histories. You can move over these great distances because you have access and are looking for these energy resources, but you're also trying to stay in contact with your habitat, which is moving and very dynamic. The other problem we've got is that polar bears are massive in comparison to Arctic grizzly bears. They're about 2 to 3 times larger than Arctic grizzly bears. So this is one of the consequences. If you're going to be active in the winter when it is incredibly cold, you have to be big. You have to be big because your prey is big, it's cold, it's easier to stay warm if you're big, and basically if you're bigger, you can carry more energy with you. So there are all these life history constraints that are coming to basically push polar bears, and some people are very optimistic about the future, that somehow we're going to undo several million years of evolution. There's no evidence for that. There's none whatsoever. People can talk about polar bears catching some seals in open water, and we've known about that for many decades now. That's not the issue. If they were able to exploit these resources during these ice-free periods during the summer when the bears are on shore, they would be doing it already. Why aren't they doing it? If it's such a good strategy to swim around in the ocean, why do they bother coming ashore? Why do they curl up on land and die of starvation when they could be swimming around in the ocean? It makes no sense, ecologically or otherwise. And we have done the experiment. Nature has done it for us. These are some of the fossil finds of polar bears in the Baltic Sea and the Scandinavian area from about 10,000 to 42,000 years ago. We know that the bears were here because we have a fossil record for them. They're not here anymore. They didn't decide to swim around in the Baltic Sea for the last 40,000 years and catch seals. That was not a viable life strategy. They didn't move on shore and breed with brown bears and become some sort of hybrid grizzly bear, polar bear cross. They disappeared. But what's even more interesting is this is a graph showing the distribution of ring seals. And if we look at this, this is the Baltic Sea. We still have ring seals. There's enough ice that forms in the Baltic Sea to keep ring seals, but we no longer have polar bears. They disappear in areas where there's insufficient sea ice. So this idea that they're going to adapt, that everything's going to be fine, I'm sorry, I might be the bearer of bad news, and just before lunch, that's a little difficult, but it's not a good news story looking forward. But people do have the misconception that populations are going extinct now, that all the bears are drowning, and we heard about this a bit yesterday from Marcus Dick. It's not that dire yet, but no conservation biologist takes the status of an animal today and believes that that is the status of the animal going forward, because we do conservation-based assessments. And in conservation, we look ahead 3 generations. For a polar bear, that's about 45 years into the future. And yes, we have to base our best estimates on what our sea ice scientists are telling us and our climate scientists are telling us. But the best analysis that was done by far was done by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they predicted a 66% decline within 40 years. And this is a global assessment, so it includes polar bears throughout the European Arctic as well as those in the North American Arctic. So what is changing? And now I'm going to touch on some of the life history characteristics. I'm going to focus on global warming, but industrial development I'll talk about, and not so much on harvest patterns. We heard a lot about that yesterday. Toxic chemicals we're going to hear about later on today. But I'll just touch on some food web issues. I'm not going to talk about parasites and disease, but the Arctic is changing. We have new diseases, new parasites. The system is not how we know it. Just to put it into perspective, Arctic shipping. The Arctic, as the sea ice disappears, is seen by some countries as a great boon. There's almost no area in the Canadian Arctic that is staked by either oil, gas, gold, diamonds, or uranium. The interest in these resources is absolutely profound. We will have shipping routes moving both across Eurasia and North America, and of course with unknown consequences, introduction of new species, for example, but also breaking up polar bear habitat, ring seal habitat. And just to put one example on the map, we have a proposed mine called the Baffinland Iron Mine that will move 20 million tons of iron ore from the Canadian Arctic through polar bear habitat for 20 years with a maximum of 242 trips through that area per year. Now, maybe that doesn't sound like a big deal to most people, but I think if you're a polar bear living in that area, it might be altering your environment. So we are changing this environment, both with climate, but also with exploration. These are offshore, so this is the area right next to Alaska, in the western part of Canada. These are recent oil and gas leases, and if you notice, a lot of people said that the newest leases are sort of getting out into the deep water, and we've been monitoring polar bears in this area with satellite telemetry, and this is where the bears go. The bears cross through these areas. As the ice moves north in the summer, the bears follow it, and then they follow it back south, right through these areas. The potential for oil spills is there is no question. What it means for the bears in the longer term is very difficult to say, but we don't have adequate monitoring programs in place to understand those changes. Polar bears are marine mammals. Global warming is simply habitat loss. All species have a distribution based on some sort of climatic envelope. They are usually less abundant at the southern end and less abundant at the northern end. And this envelope for where polar bears will live is shifting, and it's shifting northwards. The problem is you can't push them northward into new habitats like other species. We've seen variants of this graph the last 2 days. The sea ice is declining. This is for September at 13% per decade. I defy you to find me a conservation biologist anywhere that says that that sort of habitat loss is not a concern. When you're losing over 1% of your habitat per year, you are in trouble if you look forward, and particularly if you look forward about 45 years into the future. The problem is, this is probably very conservative. This might be a better fit to the data where we're starting to see accelerated loss. And this brings up great concern because this is how it changes. We get some climate warming. And for a polar bear, it changes the sea ice, which is their habitat. There's no question the ice is changing dramatically as polar bears view it. It means there's less food for the bears, which means the bears are bringing less body fat with them. They're in poor condition. This poor condition for pregnant females means they give birth to fewer cubs, smaller cubs. These cubs have lower survival, and ultimately we're not getting the recruitment, the number of new animals into the population that we need to sustain them, and we see population declines. Now we can only monitor declines in a handful of these 19 populations. Most populations we do not have adequate data. So the other problem is this is how the world used to look to a polar bear. They would see sea ice from January to December. With warming, what we've seen is that there's been a fasting period. This is the period when they rely only on the body fat that they bring with them on shore. And this period is increasing with global warming, and it's starting to push into the two feeding periods that are most important. The major feeding period is in the springtime, and a smaller feeding period as the ice is reforming in the winter. So the problem is we're pushing the bears in three different ways. We're taking them away from their food earlier, we're making them go longer with less body stores, and we're not letting them go back to feed as early in the winter as they used to. When I first started working in Western Hudson Bay, every bear was gone from shore by about the first week of November. Now the bears are leaving about the first week of December. That's how much it's happened in just the 30 years that I've been working in that area. And the ice is breaking up earlier, about 1 month earlier. So it's a simple story. Polar bears make a living from eating seals. They turn it into energy. They use that energy for body maintenance, for activity, for growth, and reproduction. When you take those energy stores down, there's less energy for growth and reproduction. Polar bears in some populations that have been well studied in at least 2 different areas are somewhere around 5 to 10% smaller in body length than they used to be. They're smaller, they just don't have the energy to dedicate to growth. Reproductive rates are down severely in some populations, and to look forward to greater declines in the future. Well, we saw this photo yesterday. I caught this bear with Dr. Ian Sterling in 1985. She's one of the fattest females that we ever caught. She's wearing a small radio on her head. We know that she was successfully producing cubs. She was incredibly fat. But what's interesting about this is female is 450 pounds, The year before, we caught her and she was 99 kilograms. She was just absolutely skinny. So in the period of 1 year, she increased her weight over 4 times. But that is the life history strategy of these animals. These females in this population will go 8 months without feeding. But the problem is they cannot go 9 or 10 months without feeding and successfully produce offspring. So when we look at the data, and what you see here is this is the trend in the mass of lone adult females in the Western Hudson Bay population in Canada. These would be pregnant females. This is the minimum mass that a female must attain in order to reproduce. You can see already that some individuals are not meeting that threshold, and the last few years of data are indicating this decline has continued. So this is the challenge. If you're not producing new animals, it's impossible to sustain a harvest from these populations. And it gets even more challenging because this is based on work that I have been doing with my graduate students. And what you can see is depending on how long the bears are on shore, there are different rates of mortality. So historically, we would have seen 3% mortality in the Western Hudson Bay population. And this is for adult males. So this is the most robust animals in the population. The problem is we're now about 20 weeks at least, and we're shifting towards probably more like 20 to 23 weeks. But it would take only 1 year of ice-free period of about 24 to 25 weeks, and we would see half the bears disappear. And there's every indication that sea ice is incredibly variable between years, and we could see a massive die-off in these populations any time now. And so the concerns are that we have created a perfect storm to see very sudden changes. We have been seeing gradual changes to this point, but you can only push an animal so far before there is a threshold for which they cannot persist. Now, everybody was looking at fat bears yesterday, so I decided I'd put up these pictures. This is not a polar bear being cute. This is an adult female polar bear. She has 2 cubs that are about 10 months old. She can't stand up anymore. She's dying of starvation. This was in Western Hudson Bay in November 2010. There's no reason for a female with 2 cubs to be dying of starvation. There's something gone wrong here in the system. You can view the footage. There's a video of this. It's disturbing, and I don't show it in public because many people find it quite upsetting. Basically, both cubs died about the 23rd of November. So to think of this as some sort of abstract concept that's based on models, that's based on no data, is a misrepresentation of the data that we have. The data is profound. The indications are very clear about the future of some populations. Some populations will do well for some time in the future. But with this, we bring a whole host of new pressures, increases in human-bear interactions. And we heard very much about having polar bears in communities, and this is something we're seeing throughout the Arctic, everywhere. Russia, Norway, Greenland, Canada, everywhere you go, there are more bears around people. And it's not necessarily because there's more bears, it's because the distribution of bears is changing, because the sea ice is changing. The bears come closer to shore because there's less ice. And if you look at the data, this is from, again, Western Hudson Bay, Churchill, Manitoba, the polar bear capital of the world. This is the number of problem bears that were handled by the government between 1970 and 2005. So if you look at the number of bears that they are handling, it's going up dramatically. The problem is, from data that was collected by government scientists, during the same period, the population was in decline by 22%. So as the number of problem bears goes up, the population was actually declining. So these are some of the challenges in trying to sort out what local people see, what scientific data has, and trying to develop appropriate management strategies to try to reduce human pressures on these populations going forward. Drowning bears is a big issue. Again, this was an adult male bear. We don't know why it died. We don't know necessarily that it drowned, but it was presumed to have. This was off the coast of Alaska. The problem is polar bears are very good at swimming. And I have no problem with a 800 kilogram adult male polar bear swimming huge distances, several hundred kilometers. But you cannot expect a female coming out of her den in the springtime with a 10 kilogram cub to take her cub through the water for more than anything but a few minutes. They die of hypothermia. We know that happens. It's not possible for them to go through open water. So if they have to go through open water, those cubs are very unlikely to survive. We see other events. Polar bears have always eaten other polar bears. Grizzly bears eat other grizzly bears, and black bears eat other black bears. It's not a problem. But is this a symptom of climate change or not? We know that some of these bears are nutritionally stressed and are starting to turn on other more vulnerable individuals in the population for food. So again, this cannibalism is strictly for nutritional gain. There's no reproductive benefit in this context because this is happening long outside of the breeding season. So when you look at the Arctic, there's some key features. One of them is polar cod. That's a species. It's an ugly little fish. But if you take that fish away, the whole system changes because that ecosystem and that fish is dependent on the presence of sea ice. If you do not have sea ice, you do not have polar cod. If you don't have sea ice, you don't have ring seals. If you don't have sea ice, you don't have polar bears. But that's not to say that there won't be an ecosystem. There will be a new ecosystem in the Arctic. It just won't contain polar bears. And if you look at what's happening through many parts of the Arctic, we're seeing it. We're seeing changes in the fish composition. We're seeing it right down into the invertebrates that are in these areas. We're seeing increasing number of whales. The new top predator is going to compete directly with polar bears for the same sorts of prey in this transition period. Killer whales are moving into the Arctic in very high rates. They will eat the same species of seals that polar bears feed on, but they will feed on them during the open water period. So you can see that there's a change coming, and it's happening in many, many different ways. And this is data that was produced in the, this should say the Eastern Canadian Arctic, not Western Canadian. And in this context, you can see that the number of observations by local people is going up dramatically. Killer whales are moving in. Killer whales don't like sea ice. They have a big fin on their back. They're only found on the fringes of sea ice or in ice-free waters. So their changes are coming. They're coming dramatically, and they're coming very quickly. And I think to close off here, because I know it's just about lunchtime, scientists were probably wrong. I think that we thought that we had 40 years, and the American assessment thought that we had 40 years before we'd see massive changes, but we're losing populations much, much before 2050. I think that all indications are that many of our populations are right on the threshold. It would take one bad year or 2 bad years in a row to push these populations over the end. So the work I do is extremely expensive, and I'll just note that I have many different funding organizations that support our research, and I'll acknowledge them, and merci beaucoup.